Hello, Noble Knitter, it's Nancy Queen, and recently my 21-year-old Gen Z daughter was looking for a faux fur bag. She saw a few on Etsy, other places online, and she wanted to buy it. And I said, wait a second, I have some faux fur yarn that I think would look beautiful, and it knits up really fast. So I made her a faux fur tote. It looks great, just like the one she's been looking for. Nice long handles, and I let you guys choose the lining. So now I'm going to show you how I did it. Quick and easy project, great for a beginner. So let's dive right in. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click the bell to get notified every time I post. For this project, I'm using Knit Picks Fable Fur yarn. It's a size 6 super bulky weight yarn, and it comes in really great colors for a bag. I also need a size 16-inch circular, size 15 needle, a pair of 11 double-pointed needles, scissors, stitch marker, finishing needle, and then some sewing supplies for the inside of the bag. You'll also find links to all of these materials in the description below. The bag itself is knitted in the round on circular needles, and then we're going to sew a seam at the bottom to join that circular knit. Now the handles are done separately, and I'll show you those a bit later. I'm going to start my project by making a slip knot and then casting on 50 stitches. Use whatever is the most comfortable cast on for you. I'm going to use the long tail cast on. It's my favorite go-to cast on, and you can see how it's done in this link above. As you're casting onto your circular needle, you'll see your cast on stitches are eventually going to work themselves around to the other point on the needle, and that's exactly what we want so that we can join this in the round in just a few minutes. Once I've cast on all my stitches, I'm going to trim the tail to about 4 to 6 inches so that I don't accidentally knit it. Now it's time to place the stitch marker on the right hand needle. That is the side where the last stitch you've cast on. And we're going to bring the other end all the way around to the other needle on the left, making sure not to twist those stitches that are on the needle. And now we're ready to start knitting. So I'm going to knit as I normally would from left to right, and that stitch marker is just going to hold my place so that I know when I've knitted around. And you're just going to start knitting, and you're going to keep knitting around and around. When you get to the stitch marker, you're just going to slip that stitch marker from one needle to the other and keep on going until your bag measures 13.5 inches from the beginning. When your bag measures 13.5 inches from the beginning, it's time to bind off. So I'm going to remove the stitch marker, and now I'm going to bind off by knitting the first stitch. Then I'm going to knit the second stitch, and I'm going to take that first stitch and slip it up and over the needle. That's one stitch bound off. Now I'm going to repeat that by knitting the next stitch and then take that first stitch up and over. Knit the next stitch, take the first stitch up and over. And you can see here how my stitches are coming off the needle. Now when you're down to the last stitch on the needle, you're going to pull a length of about 24 inches and then cut that tail and pull it through that last stitch that's on the needle. Now with that long tail, we are going to sew the bottom sides together, and this will close up the bottom of the tote. Pick up your yarn needle, and then so your bag is laying flat, that will designate the sides of the bag. So you've got the front and the back. So we're just going to go through the front and the back of each, and I'm just going to weave back and forth all the way along. So I'm going to go in, pick up a stitch, and then I'm going to go back to the other side, pick up a stitch, and this is going to make a nice clean finish that you won't see. It's going to look beautiful. It's a grafted cast on, or grafted finishing. Great way to sew a seam. And look, there's the bottom. You can't see that it's actually been sewn together, and you're just going to do this all the way along that bottom edge. Now when you're at the last stitch, you're going to go into the last stitch, but you're going to leave a little loop before you pull it all the way through. See, I have a little loop here on the bottom. Now I'm going to take my needle through that loop, and that will kind of fasten it so that stitch isn't going anywhere. And now I'm just going to weave in the yarn end. Now we're ready to make the handles. So I'm going to make a slip knot, and then I'm going to cast on 5 stitches total. And we're just using 2 double pointed needles for this. Use your favorite cast on, and you're going to put 5 stitches on that needle. Okay, I've got my 5 stitches. Now, normally you would put that in the other hand and knit it, but in this case we're going to slide it down to the other end of the needle and then knit it. It's crazy, right? But this technique works. So we're going to knit those 5 stitches. Then when we get to the end of the row, we're not going to turn our work. We're actually going to slide it again all the way down to the other end of that double pointed needle. Now see, the tail's at the wrong end, but you're just going to pull it over and continue knitting, and this does end up working. It looks a little funky in the beginning, but it's going to make a beautiful handle for your tote. So we're going to knit those 5 stitches again, and then when we finish that, we're going to slide it down to the other end and knit it again. And you're just going to keep doing this again and again. And if you pull it down a little bit like I just did, you'll see our tube is starting to form. So I've made some progress on my handle, and look, it's a really beautiful furry tube. Looks great on both sides, and see how it shapes up as the handle. That's what it's going to look like. So you're going to continue knitting this until it measures 24 inches, and then knit another one just like it. Now I forgot to mention, you're just going to bind off the way you normally would, and as you can see here, I've already attached one of the handles by sewing it onto the one side of the bag. So now I'm ready to sew on the other handle. And I'm just going to flatten out the bag and position it evenly over the handles. And now I'm going to attach the new handles on the other side at the exact same spot on the other side where I've sewn the handles, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to attach the yarn, thread the yarn through a yarn needle, and then sew it onto the bag. And I like to really sew it in there so that I know even if I put a lot of stuff in this bag, it's not going to go anywhere. So you want to make sure that you're getting through both sides of the tube when you sew this, and if you go over it a second time, that's okay too. So I let you guys vote for the lining, and I had the polka dot patterns and this swirl pattern, and just by like 1 or 2 votes you guys chose the swirl pattern, so that's what I'm using to line the bag. Now to make the lining, I take a quick measurement. It's 12 inches across, so I'm going to add a 1/2 inch here for the seaming, and then when I'm going to measure it vertically, and I end up with 13 and a half, so I'm going to add, oh, it's almost 14. So I'm going to add an extra 1/2 inch to that so that I can seam it properly. So I lay out my fabric with the fold at the bottom so that I only have to sew the sides. The bottom won't need to be sewn because it's where the fold is. And then I'll be folding down the top to create a nice finished edge. So I'm going to use those measurements I just took and then cut the fabric. Now before I sew my fabric, I really want to press it, and I use this really nice wool pressing board. I'll put a link in the description for it, but I lay it out on the pressing board, and it's a lot more convenient for me than a huge ironing board. Easy to take in and out, and I just use the cotton setting, some steam, and I iron that out so that my lining won't have any folds in it. I want it nice and clean. Now this is a step a lot of people want to avoid because it is a bit of a pain in the neck, but This ironing, let me tell you, is the difference between a homemade project and a handmade project. It's going to give your project, your bag, a really finished look and very polished. And you're not going to have to deal with weird seams appearing in the middle of your bag lining. So take a moment to iron it. It's going to make a huge difference in the finished look. Now that you have it ironed, you're going to put the right sides together. So see where that fold was? That is where you're going to seam it again. So you line everything up so that the right side is on the inside, because that's going to be what you see when you look into the lining. And now we're going to press that bottom edge one more time the opposite way to give it a nice crisp edge. I like to really press it down, get the steam going, and make sure that it's going to stay like that. For the next step, if you have a sewing machine, by all means, go ahead and sew the sides of the lining. But if you don't, you're just going to need to use some basic thread, and then you're just going to sew the sides of each. So I'm hand sewing it today. I made a knot at the end of my yarn, and the end of my thread rather, and now I'm just going to hand sew by going up and down all the way along the edge. And if you just go down in and then up, you don't have to be on the back side of the work. It's a lot easier to do it this way. Let me get my fabric all set here. And you can see I'm doing just a simple running stitch about 1/4 of an inch from the outside edges of my sides. When you finish the one side, then you're going to go ahead and sew the seam on the other side. When I've finished both of those seams, I go over it one more time with a press of the iron just to even everything out. Now before I sew the lining into the bag, I go ahead and I turn down the edge so that I have a nice clean edge that won't come undone, and it looks clean from the inside and professional. So I turn down the edge, and now I'm going to use my iron to press those seams down. Now you're ready to put the lining in the bag. So with the wrong sides facing each other, you're going to tuck the lining in the bag. And you'll see when we look at it, it's all lined up. And when you would open the bag, this beautiful lining will show. And then we're going to line it up. I like to pin it in place, and then I'm going to sew it. There are quite a few different stitches you could use to sew this in. I'm just going to use a simple running stitch to sew mine into place. I also want to point out that I sew my lining in about 1/4 of an inch below the fur edge because I don't want it to show on the outside. I want it to be a lining that's on the inside of the bag. I really hope you enjoy making this tote, and I'll see you in the next video.